the ancients knew this. Like, clearly, you look at every ancient wisdom tradition, the idea is there. Whether it's, Maya in the Eastern traditions, Plato's cave in Western esoteric and philosophical traditions, this notion of simulation hypothesis is actually not a new thing.
Most of these traditions are started
Right.
when someone peeks outside of the physical world or peeks outside of the simulation. It happens either because of that or what scholars call a theophany. And the theophany is when something from the outside, some element of the divine, breaks into the physical world. Today, if you look at World of Warcraft, or you look at Fortnite, or any of the newer games since then, but those games are all three-dimensional worlds. We only need to render that part of the world that you can see. And to me, this reminded me so much of what quantum mechanics and the collapse of the probability wave is telling us. It's like, render only that which is observed. It looked like an optimization technique. And so I thought, that's kind of weird. Why would the universe work like we actually build computer games? And just like, I'm not really talking to you right now, am I?
Yeah, you're just talking to a simulation of a simulation, pretty much.
Exactly. And there are other aspects of physics that remind us that we might be in a simulation. But for me, that was one of the key points.
Riz, I think we are kindred spirits, my friend. I heard you describing in another podcast how you started going down this path and that you were sort of living these parallel lives in your old kind of identity as somebody running a startup, but then also having the seeking disposition and like going down all these different rabbit holes on the side. And that's like exactly, I mean, I wasn't doing everything you were doing day job wise, but I relate to that so much. That was my life for a very long time.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, probably who are into this stuff end up living these double lives. And for me, I was in Boston originally, right outside of MIT. And that area back in the 90s was a little more conservative, particularly, with the financial industry and stuff compared to, say, California. And so, that was part of the reason why these things were so separate. I mean, I think today, people are more accepting of everything from, Reiki energy healing to UFO discussions, at least. They might still think you're crazy, but at least they're willing to discuss it with you, which is good. But that wasn't always the case. But yeah, so I had that for many years. And part of the reason why I wrote the simulation hypothesis was because it allowed me to bring together these many different threads of my life that I had been exploring for a long time, really. Things like the Monroe Institute, where I been trying the hemisync for out-of-body experiences, or shamanic journeying without psychedelics. We would use drums to do that, and I'd even explored some energy healing and other things as well. So I had a lot of experience in different consciousness phenomena, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I specifically wanted to ask you about Monroe and the gateway experience and all that whole avenue, because that's something I've explored as well. I did a gateway retreat about a year and a half ago at this point, and I'll spare you the punchline of my experience. But how did you end up connecting with Monroe, and what was your experience like with them?
Well, I may not be the best person to speak about it, that only because, and I'll give you my thoughts, but only because it was so long ago. So I actually went to the Monroe Institute back in the 90s. So I think it was 1997. Oh, wow. So it was literally almost 30 years ago now. And back then, they had the cassette tapes for, their hemisync, the binaural beats, etc. And back then I actually got into it because, there's a whole class of phenomena that are kind of like next to each other. And I had started to explore, these phenomena on my own, and that included lucid dreaming. Which I initially started exploring through Castaneda's work. I don't know if you're familiar with Carlos Castaneda. A lot of younger people today aren't so familiar with his work, but he was on the cover of Time magazine back in the 70s as the grandfather of the New Age movement at the time for the hippie generation, basically. And, there's a lot of controversy about how much of that did he actually do, how much of the psychedelics did he do, was his teacher a real person or not, yet what I found most interesting were his teachings on dreaming and the dream reality versus the physical reality. And so, later I got into Tibetan dream yoga, which is also a type of lucid dreaming, but the purpose is different, right? The purpose is very much to, as you learn to wake up inside the dream state, the idea is you should be able to continuously go, from this waking state to that dream state and back. And if you're able to do that, then you should be able to also remember that this world is like a dream, and that we are basically asleep, and there's a part of ourselves that is outside of this world, and we have forgotten about that. And so it's about breaking down, that wall between your self and your quote unquote real self, which of course is also a dream self. So anyway, that's just to say that I had explored different phenomena like this. And astral traveling in the Monroe Institute, was known for that, for out of body experiences and astral traveling. And so I went down, and I found it very interesting. For those who haven't been, and I'm assuming it's probably still done the same way, they have these kind of like cubby holes or bunk beds almost. And inside, there's these headphones you put on, and you can kind of draw the curtain. And then you go out and you actually, um, afterwards you talk about your experiences. And I'm sure they've enhanced the program a bit since then, because that was the early days. But for me, I found I don't have a problem getting into altered states.
Hmm.
So, I found having the headphones on wasn't the easiest way for me to get into an altered state. It was more about the breathing, because I had done a lot
Hmm.
of yogic breathing until then and a lot of different types of meditation. But, they have a whole process where you set aside all of your worries and all of these things that are bothering you, and that makes it easier to then go into these different states. But I did have one really interesting experience. I don't know that I've talked about it too much. It'll
Yeah,
be
I'd
in a
love to
book
hear it.
that's coming out soon, and it was basically I connected, and for me it was very similar to what I call shamanic journey, in that it wasn't like a traditional out of body experience where you're outside and you're looking at your body in the room. So I didn't really have that kind of experience, but I had what I call a shamanic journey, where part of you travels elsewhere and you're still aware of your body here in your physical body laying down, but you're also aware that there's things going on and that these things have a sense of reality to them, and you can kind of direct it and guide it. And so you've got like these kind of two things happening at the same time. And in this case, I connected with what I only assume might have been a past life
Hmm.
or an older version. It was somewhere in India, back, I don't know how long ago, but it was a long time ago. And it was a field, and there was a version of me, or let's say that was a sadhu, which means a spiritual seeker,
Yeah.
who had on kind of a loincloth. And, that's kind of an archetype these days, but I felt like, okay, this is someone that I was connected to in the past. And he was sitting with his back against a tree. I forget what kind of tree it was. Might have been a palm tree, or probably might have been some other kind of tree. And I connected with him, and he said, "Look, you're doing it all wrong." And I said, "What do you mean
Hmm.
I'm doing it all wrong?" He goes, "Don't you remember? You've learned this before, meaning in a
Wow.
past life." And so he said, "You have to not lay down. You should sit up like I am." And he was leaning against the back of the tree. And then he said, "Okay, now what? I want you to watch what I'm doing." And he basically went out through his third eye,
Hmm.
up above, and he looked down, and I could see exactly what he saw for that. So it was almost like I was inhabiting his consciousness, looking down at the tree, and then it came back. And so there might have been more to the conversation, but this was 30 years ago. So
Yeah.
that was the gist of the conversation, was that, for you, it's a slightly different procedure than, because I was starting to feel the headphones and the curtain being drawn and being
Yeah.
in this cubbyhole was all a little restrictive for me, although it's worked really well for other people. So I definitely recommend people try the Monroe Institute or try the Gateway Experience. Now they have apps that you can do, which makes it much easier than what we had to do back in the day. But so that was like one of the more profound experiences that I think I had back then. And then later, this was that same year, 1997, or maybe it was 98, the year after. I was sitting at my desk in the afternoon, and the sun was shining. I was in Boston, and I was tired, and I just kind of started to doze off on my chair, and I did exactly what he said, and I went out my third
Hmm.
eye, and I could actually see myself
Wow.
just a little ways, and then I came back in, and that was, I would say, the only time that I had that kind of an experience. I've had plenty of experiences in dreams where I left my body and I was wandering around the building, but I didn't necessarily see myself. So to me, it was a validation that there's something interesting going on here, and different people had different reactions back then because I was kind of
Very much.
playing anthropologist. I was asking people,
Yeah, very much
what
so.
kind of
Very
experiences they
fascinating.
had. Yeah.
And yeah, so first of all, it's still exactly the same. They very much stuck to the old school sort of process, which I like. Like when I first got there, I had been reading Journeys Out of the Body by Bob Monroe. I hadn't gone deep down the sort of Monroe rabbit hole yet, and wasn't a huge Kool-Aid drinker. But I'm always a very open-minded. I just have a very open-minded, seeking disposition. But I'm not a Kool-Aid drinker. I want to know what's real, and if something really works, and I don't want to fool myself into thinking something that's bullshit really works. So, do you know Chris Ramsey, the podcaster, content
Yeah, I
creator?
met him at the Psy Games
Yeah, yeah,
last
yeah.
year in Charlottesville, which is right near the Monroe Institute.
Yes. Yeah, so he introduced me to Monroe Institute. So I wound up going through him, and he had just had a really profound experience there, and I trusted him. So I was like, okay, I'm going to check this out. I'm going to go open minded. And I won't go. I've told this story so many times, so I can either tell you the short version or skip over my story altogether. But what I wanted to really say anyway is that you sort of had the experience that I was hoping to have, in that I really wanted to connect with. Like you're probably familiar with this idea that's in a lot of mystical traditions and esoteric traditions, which is essentially the idea of the personal daimon or the personal guide,
Mm.
right? I really wanted to
Yes.
connect with that. Like that was my goal more so than going out of body.
Right.
And then hilariously, on the very last day of the retreat, I had not really I had a lot of very good experiences throughout the whole week, but nothing approaching, I really feel like I'm going to leave my body. And then on the final day of the retreat, I like did they call it clicking out when you were there?
I don't recall that
Okay.
term. It might have, but I don't recall the term. I remember it was
So
Focus 12, was it? It was one of these,
yeah,
mind
there's
mind
10,
awake, body
12.
asleep.
Yeah,
Focus
yeah.
10, yeah.
10,
Yeah.
12, 15, 21. So I click out or whatever. I just kind of like go unconscious during the meditation. And then suddenly, I guess I'm telling the story again now. Suddenly I'm like in a room, like physically, like very lucid dream in a room, so real that I just think it's real. And I'm looking out a window and it's nothing is strange or dreamlike. It just feels 100% real. And then I remember like, no, I'm not here. I'm in the check unit meditating. And then as soon as I had that thought, I'm back in the check unit, and the sensations that they try to teach you to evoke are just going crazy. And I like tried to sit up, and I 100% peeled away from the physical and went like started levitating, and I freaked out. I mean, I was trying to get control, but I was terrified. And it was very visceral, very, very strong sensations. And long story short, couldn't get control of it, started yelling for help. And then I just kind of remerged with my body and freaked out. But your experience sounded very much like you almost connected with a guide like intelligence of some sort who is
Yeah.
trying to teach you a technique or remind you of a technique or something. That's really fascinating.
Well, it's funny because I was hoping to have the kind of experience that you
Right.
had. And, but yeah, I mean, it could have been a personal guide. I almost felt like it was either myself or a teacher of mine from a previous life. I mean, I was born in Pakistan and grew up in that part of the world, which of course was all India. I mean, it was just
Yeah.
Northwest India back in the day. And so it's very familiar to me. But it's not like I connected with that particular person again. So it could have been an archetype. It could have been my
Hmm,
guide in the
hmm.
form of an archetype, or it could have been, I mean, the past isn't really what we think it is. So when we say past lives, and, I write a little bit about this in my book, The Simulated Multiverse, that we may be choosing the past as we go, gets us down a whole different rabbit hole, which we
Mm.
can go down later if we want. But from that perspective, but yeah, it was an interesting experience, and it was a series of experiences. And my very first book was called Zen Entrepreneurship, and it was
Oh, okay.
about when I was living this double life, where it was about my first startup and my first foray into different consciousness experiences and meditation with a teacher, kind of like a Don Juan like teacher. That was my first attempt at trying to bring these worlds together. And I wrote that like many years ago. And the book is not as well known as like my book, The Simulation Hypothesis. But I have been writing a sequel for it for many years. And the sequel is called The Zen Entrepreneur and the Dream.
Mm,
And it's
mm.
really about, various attempts to get out of body, lucid dreaming, includes my experience at the Monroe Institute, and some of these other experiences as well.
Yeah, I love that because obviously you're known for your sort of intellect and the fact that you, like you said, you've written these books on simulation hypothesis and you've become one of the like leading voices in that whole vein. But that was one of the first things that interested me is like, hey, this guy's a seeker as well, and he's clearly like tried to have these experiences himself. And I think you really have to have a holistic view of trying to understand it from a primary POV subjectively and an intellectual POV, and there are very few people who really do both. And like this is why I'm excited to talk to you because you do both of these things, and that's just a rare opportunity.
No, I was just gonna say I agree with you because, I'm in academia now, and, they're very left-brained in academia, even though some people may have had personal experiences. And then I spent a lot of time with people in the UFO community,
Yeah.
and people in other spiritual communities, and, I think that having the experiences to convince you that there is something else going on. I mean, I'll tell you another quick story from that.
Hmm.
It's actually in Zen Entrepreneurship in the first book, but this really convinced me something weird was going on. And it was a precognitive dream related to my business, which convinced me, okay, something wonky is happening with time. And what the
Yeah.
story we've been told is not the full story. And then things like this would happen to me in my dreams relatively often, like once a month or once every other month or so. That made me question it. And so what happened was one day I was running my startup, and one morning I had a dream about being at a business conference. And I think we should pay attention to the repeating landscapes in our dreams. And in those days, when I was an entrepreneur, this kind of generic business conference was a setting that I used to see a lot. I never see it
Hmm.
anymore, probably because I left, Silicon Valley almost 8 years ago now. But back then, it was a common thing. But it was a little unusual, and there was this guy who showed up, who was a competitor of ours named Mark. I was like, Mark, what are you doing here? I haven't heard from you guys, because we hadn't heard of their company in
Hmm.
literally over a year, and which was good in a sense because they were a competitor of ours. And I was like, we started talking and asking what he was doing, and the dream ended. And I just thought that was odd. I'd never had a dream with this
Hmm.
particular business competitor in there before. And why did I have the dream that morning? So I went into the office, and we had a product that worked on top of IBM's products back in the day. It was called Lotus Notes, their product. But
Oh
anyway,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, leaving the specifics aside, our product worked with their product and bridged the gap between, IBM, Lotus, Microsoft, Oracle. It was like a bridge. And as soon as I walk in the office, it was around 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from the product manager at IBM. And he goes, "Hey, you're one of our top partners. I just wanted to let you know we're going to do an announcement later today. I didn't want you to be surprised by this announcement." I said, "Oh, why would I be surprised?" He goes, "Well, we know you have this product to connect our products with Oracle, et cetera. But we're going to be releasing our own product. And unfortunately, it's probably going to kill your product, because this is going to
Ooh.
be our official way to do this." I was like, "Great. Thanks for calling," like sarcastically. But then I said, "How come I've never heard of this product? If you're going to announce it today, you must have been developing it for a long time." And IBM's a big company, and we're good partners, so we know people there. He goes, "Oh, do you remember that competitor of yours, Mark, from Edge Research?
Yeah.
We bought them like a year ago, and they're up in New Hampshire, and they've been doing this kind of, secretly, and now we're
Hmm.
gonna release Mark's product." I thought, "That's weird." Okay, so I had the dream in the morning, and then later, he appears on that day, and it was just so bizarre and
Yeah.
so
That's
unusual.
incredible.
I mean, it wasn't like there was any practical use for that information, because it's not like we could do anything at that point. But it was later I would find out, I would get the message that that was a clue for me that, we all have different types of skills, and one of my skills, I guess, is in the dream state, being able to find out things, but also a clue that time isn't what we think it is, that space isn't what we think it is, and that there's more going on. And so
Yeah.
that was one of the first things that convinced me, okay, this stuff is real. Like, precognitive dreams are real. And I've described that to people who are a little more left brain. They're like, "Well, so what? You had this dream." I'm like, "No, no, I had the dream that morning."
Yeah.
And it wasn't after he called me I had the dream about him. It was before. Somehow they confuse that when I try to explain. No, that is basically a precognitive dream, of just
Yeah.
a couple hours in that case. Yeah.
That's mind blowing. Yeah, that's such a great example of synchronicity or precognition through dreams. And this that even better illustrates the point that I wanted to pivot into just a second ago anyway, which is that hello, my friend. Let us intermission briefly. Did you know that I have been diligently grinding out patron/member only content every week or close to it? The library is girthing well into the dozens at this point, and I just uploaded a riff in the beautiful skiff with my man Chris Ramsey. Check that out in the members section. And like I said, much, much more. Or over on patreon.com/third eye drops. And if you do join in over there, you will also get access to a patron only Discord server, occasional live hangs, and more. Please do tickle that algorithm, like, sub, comment, etc. if you have not already. Unfortunately, I've noticed as of late, sometimes the algorithm just does not push this content nearly as hard as it does other times. So you will miss out if you are not subbed. One last thing, not a sponsor, but a friend. Myself, Chris Ramsey, Riz Virk, and many other beautiful beings will be at Contact in the Desert this year at the end of May. It is going to be a blast. If you wish to join the festivities, I have secured a coupon code for you, which you can find in the description and pinned in the comments. Much love, and back to it. That's mind blowing. Yeah, that's such a great example of synchronicity or precognition through dreams. And that even better illustrates the point that I wanted to pivot into just a second ago anyway, which is that one of the things you talk about is that this notion of simulation hypothesis is actually not a new thing. We're coming at it from a more technical sort of way of skinning the cat now. But the ancients knew this. Like clearly, you look at every ancient wisdom tradition, and there's the idea is there. Whether it's Maya in the Eastern traditions, Plato's cave in Western esoteric and philosophical traditions, and what this points to is there clearly is some other way of knowing that is not this technical way of empiricism and getting at reality through breaking it down into reductive materialistic nuts and bolts kind of ways. It's some kind of deep capacity we have within our own consciousness to glimpse deeper truths at the surface of reality. And that again points to what I was talking about before, that it's very important to have both of these kinds of ways of knowing when you're interacting with the world and you're trying to sense make in your own life or just do practical things. Like if you're shutting yourself off to either one, you're missing out on a huge part of reality.
Yeah, and I've gone even deeper into the world's wisdom traditions, and I released the second edition of the simulation hypothesis just last year, and I had originally written the first edition back in 2019 and released it on March 31st, 2019, which was literally 20 years from the day that the Matrix was released in 99.
Nice.
But of course, in the last 5, 6 years, 7 years since then, technology has advanced quite a bit and AI has advanced quite a bit. And so part of the new version of the book is about recent developments in AI, because back then I was just predicting what might happen. But the religious area is one that I found myself going deeper and deeper into. And, what I like to say is that most of these traditions are started when someone peeks outside of the physical world,
right,
or peeks outside of the simulation, or peeks outside of Plato's cave, as it were. But then that person, so it happens either because of that or what scholars call a theophany. And the theophany is when something from the outside, some element of the divine, breaks into the physical world. Now, that could be a burning bush, like in the case of Moses. It could be the angel Gabriel in the case of Muhammad when he was fasting and laying down in the cave. It could be some other thing that breaks into the physical world. So it's usually through one of those two categories. I'm sure there's lots of little categories within those. But then that person is tasked with explaining what happened to the laypersons or the regular people of the day. And so how are they going to describe something that is one, profound, and two, possibly even ineffable, right? Which is a word that means can't be put into words. Near-death experiencers use that word a lot when they come back. And so what they have to do is they have to translate it into a set of language that can be understood by regular people. Not just understood, but remembered, since a lot of these stories initially were probably told orally, and then eventually, they were written down. And so what do? They use metaphors, right? The
Yeah.
cave is a metaphor. But Plato wasn't trying to say that we literally live in a cave. And if you look at any of the ancient scriptures, you see that they're full of metaphors. And some of these metaphors are technological metaphors. Like even in Plato's cave, he describes the sun as
Yeah.
what? A great fire, right? Fire is a kind of technology that we use and that people would be familiar with. And so all of the scriptures have these technological metaphors. I mean, you find, the gates of heaven, you find chariots, right?
Mhm.
You find books, you find clothing, like all of these things that are actually technological metaphors are used to describe what ultimate reality is all about. And even the
Right.
idea of the angels, there are different types of angels, but the more you listen to these stories, some of them start to sound like NPCs or functions that are performed.
Yeah.
And over time, what's happened is that, we've upgraded these metaphors. The Maya was an illusion, and it often meant, something to do with water, but it meant forgetting about what was happening before you went into the illusion. I'll tell an interesting story about Maya from the Hindu traditions
Please.
if we have time. It's the story of Vishnu and Narada. And Narada was one of these spiritual seekers or warrior, depending on the type of story that's being told. And he goes to Vishnu and he says, I want to understand Maya. And the god Vishnu says, my Maya is inscrutable. You can't understand
Mhm.
my Maya. And Narada insists, no, I really want to understand what is this thing called Maya, this illusion. And so Vishnu says, okay, I will show you. And, what does that sound like? Sounds like Morpheus in the
Right,
Matrix.
right, right.
So what he does is he shows him this pool of water. He says, step into this pool of water. And so Narada steps into the pool of water and suddenly he's transformed. He is now a little baby girl named Sushila, who's a princess in one of the kingdoms around Benares in ancient India. And she grows up, she lives a full life, she grows up as a princess and she's married to a prince from a neighboring kingdom. She has kids, and then a terrible thing happens. Her husband's kingdom, which is where she lives, goes to war with her father's kingdom, which is now run by her brothers. And they have this terrible war and they all kill each other, basically. And now, of course, Sushila is sad. I mean, not only is her husband dead, but her brothers, her father, and her sons, who also fought in the war, are dead. So she decides to walk to the edge of town, and depending on which version you use, either she throws herself in the funeral pyre, or either way, she walks out of town, and there's a little pool of water, but she just walks right in it because she's kind of
Mhm,
stunned at
mhm.
everything. And as she walks in the water, suddenly she's transformed. And now she's Narada again. And he's standing there with Vishnu.
Yeah.
And Vishnu goes, now you understand Maya, right? It is that aspect of forgetfulness and the power of forgetfulness. So it's not just an illusion. And so that story is a metaphorical way of trying to explain something that is very complicated, but which we all go through. And it turns out all the spiritual traditions use metaphors for the idea of forgetting. I often mention Lethe, the river
Yeah.
of forgetfulness in the Greek
Mhm.
traditions, which you cross as you incarnate and then you cross again. And then there's Mengpo, the goddess of forgetfulness, and she brews the tea of forgetfulness. And you drink the tea of forgetfulness before you're born and after you die as well. And in Islam, there is the 70,000 veils between, in the Sufi traditions especially, between you and God, which is ultimate reality. And the goal is to wake up and cut through those veils so that you can remember. In fact, the Arabic word for human is insan, and
Hmm.
insan means prisoner. And I thought, oh, that's
Interesting.
interesting. Prisoner of what? Well,
Mhm.
according to Sufis, it's prisoner of another Arabic word called nisyan. And what does nisyan mean? Nisyan means forgetfulness. So basically, we are
Wow.
all prisoners of forgetfulness. And so I gave a talk at a Islamic jurisprudence conference in the UK, and there were like scholars from Cairo and and London, and I was like, "Why are you inviting me? Like, I'm not a law I don't have a law degree, and I'm not an Islamic studies scholar." And they said, "No, no, we want you to talk about the simulation hypothesis." to talk about, some of these ideas that we're struggling with. And of course,
Yeah.
they were debating, when does ensoulment occur
Hmm.
into, the fetus or the baby? Does it happen at conception? And the same issues we're dealing with here in the US about, when is abortion okay?
Sure.
Is it the first,
Yeah.
we use trimesters, they use 40 days. They say the first 40 days, the second 40 days, or all the way until birth. And I said, well, I'm going to give you guys a different way to think about ensoulment. And there was an Ayatollah in the audience as well from Iran. I mean,
Wow.
not the Ayatollah. I mean, he's like a political leader, right? But
Yeah.
an Ayatollah is like a cardinal or a bishop. So he was
Hmm.
one
Hmm.
one of the more liberal ones. And somebody from Tehran University, which is probably one of the universities that's getting blown up as we speak. But
Yeah.
in any case, they were open minded to it. And I said, it is like when you put on the virtual reality headset. Okay, when you forget that you are outside of the simulation, and you start getting the sense impressions and everything feels so real. And so what I was doing was I was updating the metaphors used in these wisdom.
Exactly.
And in the Quran, I mean, they literally have passages would say that this life is nothing but a sport, a delusion, a
Mm.
pastime, and which basically, in modern terms, translates into game. Right. And in fact, one of them, they call it an enjoyable delusion. Okay. What's an enjoyable delusion? Well, it's like a game that you're in. Doesn't mean you're having fun all the time, because it's not. So I find that the simulation hypothesis can bring these wisdom traditions up to date. And, one of my personal heroes is a guy named Swami Yogananda,
Hmm.
who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi. I don't know if you've read Autobiography of a
Yes.
Yogi.
Yes. I haven't read it cover to cover, but I've read
Yeah.
a bunch of it. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it are just these great stories of these yogis who are like showing these supernatural techniques, right? The
Yeah.
saint with two bodies who shows up in two places, the levitating saint, all forms of telepathy. They're like creating material objects out of thin air. They're like bringing back people from the dead. So you've got all these crazy stories. But Yogananda was one of the first Indian swamis to come to the US and actually live here and establish, teaching center here. And he came in 1920. So it was literally about 100 years ago. And he was tasked at that point with explaining these ideas of Maya and karma, and, Lila. Lila means like the play, the divine play of life. If you've ever heard of the game
Hmm.
Snakes and
Yeah.
Ladders, I think we call it Shoots and Ladders here in the West, but it was called Snakes and Ladders. It
Oh,
was
yeah. Yeah.
informally referred to as the Leela, which just means the game, the divine game. And actually, all of the squares on that game were kind of meant to be like things that you do that give you karma or release your karma. And you go through these various lives, and when you reach the top level, you've basically reached a kind of enlightenment, if you will. And we've lost that spiritual context, but that was and the dice are like some of the random things that happen to you in life along the way. But anyway, he was tasked with explaining that to an American audience. And how did he do that? Well, he decided to update the technological metaphors of the past using new technology. And in the 1920s, relatively new technology was the film, film projectors. And so he basically said life
Hmm.
is like
Hmm.
a film, and it is like light and shadows of the Lord. And we are like the actors who are playing the characters on the screen. And the characters suffer, but the actors don't die. And he would encourage his students to look away from the screen, look towards the beam, he would say in his Bengali accent. And, he was saying that
Mm.
that is the light of the Lord that is projecting this kind of divine play. And so I was asked a few years ago, after I wrote the simulation hypothesis, I was asked to write a book for HarperCollins India, for younger Indians, like young professionals, not necessarily
Mm.
kids, about
Yeah.
the lessons from Autobiography of a Yogi, which was Steve Jobs' favorite book. And, it was
You're right.
he gave away copies of it at his memorial service. And I said, "You sure you want me to write this book?" I grew up in Michigan, right? I didn't really grow up in that part of the world. And they're like, "No, no, we want you to write this book because we want you to translate some of Yogananda's messages and lessons uh, to more modern terminology." And I thought about it, and I thought, well, if he was alive today, he would say, it's like a film, and we're all the actors, but we're also the audience. So we're sitting in the audience watching ourselves. We have scripts and roles we're supposed to play, but we have freedom of choice, and we can change all of that. And we're kind of all doing this together. And what does that sound like? To me, today, that sounds like a massively multiplayer online
Right.
role-playing game or an MMORPG. So that's why I think the video game metaphor is a really powerful one for basically bringing in the things that the wisdom traditions have been teaching us. But it gives us a technological way to think about this that you can actually discuss. I mean, I can go and discuss simulation theory with a physicist at MIT or Harvard. Now, they may not buy it, but at least they're willing to discuss it. You go to them and start talking about out-of-body experiences and ghosts
Right, right, right.
even
UFOs, yeah.
UFOs, anything beyond like, a certain type of nuts and bolts, they won't even have the conversation with you. So it's not even a matter of, are you going to get very far? you know?
Right, right. Yeah, this is a fantastic hinge point because you've done such a great job of demonstrating how this is essentially a ubiquitous archetype throughout the world's wisdom traditions. East, West, doesn't matter. They all have this idea that we live in either a totally false reality or a very diminutive, low resolution approximation of reality, like in the Plato's cave sort of example. Uh, but the idea is you live in some kind of false construct, some kind of simulacra, and there is a truer reality outside of this reality. And I also think, aside from the philosophical strain, it seems like we're getting closer and closer to having to confront this reality in our physics, in our technical understanding of reality. And you talk about this with great intelligence as well, particularly, with the work of Wheeler. And, like the sort of Copenhagen interpretation is probably like the one that's the most apt in terms of the idea is that there must be a sort of observer who's collapsing the wave function. But let's get into that a little bit. Like, what was it? Was there something in your own studies where it clicked with you, where it's like, oh my god, like physics is telling us this exact same thing? Like, which came
Yeah.
first actually with you? Was it the technical sort of understanding or the philosophical one?
Well, I would say the more consciousness oriented understanding came first, but it really snapped into place with the technology. So I
Mm,
was in the video game industry in Silicon Valley for over a decade. And, we had the number one game in the App Store for a while. And I became an investor and advisor to many startups that were building games, games based on TV shows like Star Trek or Game of Thrones, et cetera. But what happened was, and I've told you probably heard this story if you've listened to any of my podcasts before, but I put on a virtual reality headset. So this was after I had sold my last video game company, and I started to play this VR ping pong game. And the physics engine of the game was so good that the responsiveness was spot on. I really felt like I was hitting a ball when I moved my hand, and how fast I moved my hand really affected,
mhm.
you know, how how far the ball went towards the opponent. And the graphics weren't even that good. They were kind of crappy. But it fooled my body for a moment into thinking that this was a real game of ping pong, so
Yeah.
much so that I tried to put the paddle on the table and I tried to lean against the table just like I might do at the end of a real game of ping pong. But of course, I was standing in this room. There was no table. There was no opponent. It was just a bunch of wires coming down to this headset. And the headset was a big one. We used to call it like a toaster on our face,
Mhm,
So there was
mhm.
no mistaking that I was in virtual reality, but the fact that it fooled my instincts for a moment to think that got me thinking, how long would it take for us to get to where we could produce something like the Matrix, something that was so immersive that once you plugged in, and it didn't have to be with a virtual reality headset. If you remember in the Matrix, they used what's called a
Yeah,
brain computer interface or
yeah.
BCIs in order to plug into the Matrix. And so I laid out these 10 stages to what I call the simulation point. And for me, that is a kind of technological singularity. Now, when most people hear the term singularity, they've heard of it in one of two contexts. Either one, it's super intelligence that's going to kill us all, like the Skynet Terminator
Mhm,
scenario.
mhm.
Or two, merging of humans, silicon, and biology, which is the Ray Kurzweil version of the singularity,
Yeah.
because he had a famous book about that. The singularity is near, but the term itself was borrowed from physics, which okay, physics actually borrowed it from mathematics, but they borrowed it for trying to describe what happens as you get closer and closer to a black hole, right? And if people remember from their college classes, it's asymptotic. It goes like this, and the line goes way up. And they're like, well, we don't know what
Mhm.
happens. We call that a singularity. Like that's
Right.
the absolute center of the black hole. And a guy named Werner Vinge, who was a not only a computer science professor, but he's a well-known science fiction writer. And there's a lot of overlap between science fiction and my work, both in the simulation work and the work that I've done in academia as well. We can talk more about that later. But he came up with a paper called the Coming Technological Singularity. And he basically, used a term that von Neumann had used earlier to say that when technology grows exponentially, after that, everything will be different for humankind. And superintelligence was just one way of doing it. Networked machines was another. He had different ways that we might reach this point called the singularity. And so I call the simulation point a kind of singularity because once we're there, life for humans will be very different, which is that we can create these fully immersive worlds that are probably maintained and developed by AI. We can talk more about that in a minute if we want.
Sure.
And the recent developments of AI. But with AI characters that might seem like real characters, such that you would be able to not distinguish that the landscape is not real, not physical, and that these characters are not controlled by humans. So they're basically become NPCs. And after that, I thought, well, if we can get there, then perhaps somebody has already gotten there. And that got me down the simulation hypothesis rabbit hole with guys like Nick Bostrom and Elon Musk and others talking about the odds that we're in a simulation. But to your question, that also got me to examine the religious traditions and quantum physics. And I came up with what I'll simplify to 4 assertions. And the first of those assertions is that the universe is based on information. Right. And John Wheeler, who's my favorite physicist of the 20th century, he worked with Einstein. He was at Princeton, just down the hall from him. He also oversaw Richard Feynman's PhD, who's a very famous physicist who, honestly, he did many things, but he wrote the paper that led to today's quantum computers as well. There's a whole backstory around that that's interesting as well. But he also was the supervisor for Hugh Everett. And Hugh Everett is the guy who came up with the multiverse theory,
right.
Which we see now with, the Spider-Man. You have the 3 different actors, the Spider-Man and the Spider-Man meme, where they're all pointing at each other, like Andrew Garfield. Who's the new one? Tom Holland, I think, right?
Yep.
Tobey Maguire, yeah. Well, the explanation is they're all in a different branch of the multiverse. But Wheeler came up with this phrase, it from bit. And what he said was he kept looking for this thing called a particle. Now, even the way we name it, we call it a particle. It makes it look like it's this hard substance, just like the Greeks thought an atom was the most irreducible thing. So basically there's nothing in it. Well, it turns out that's not the case. Like what we call atoms are actually 99.9% empty space, just like, this water bottle, right? Looks real, but it's really 99.9% empty space when you go inside of it. And he said, if you keep looking at the bottom level for this thing called a particle, it's like those Russian nested dolls. I think they're called like the Matryoshka or Babushka dolls.
Yes.
If they're male or female, I guess is the difference. But it's like you keep going and there's nothing there. And he said at the bottom, all that exists is an answer to a series of yes-no questions. And those are basically bits of information. A bit is a 0 or a 1. And so he came up with this phrase, it from bit, which means anything that is physical is actually consists of bits of information.
Yes. Yeah. The idea that really the substrate, at least a physical reality, has to be some sort of information, as you're saying, that must pre-exist the sort of, I guess, physical understanding of what it is, or the measurement.
Yeah, and so that gets to the second of these propositions is that these bits of information are presented to us to look as if they're real. And this is what gets into the observer effect as well. And, the collapse of the probability weight. So the Copenhagen interpretation is probably the most well-known interpretation of the quantum measurement problem. Or quantum indeterminacy is a formal name for that. And the idea is that you can have a particle that acts like a wave because it goes through 2 of the slits in the double slit experiment. But if it was a particle, it would only go through one of those, right? A solid object can only go through one of those, but a wave goes through both and creates an interference pattern on the other side. And that's where, the idea of Schrodinger's cat comes about, because we can think of the cat that's in the box, which let's say has a 50% chance of being alive or 50% chance of being dead, because there's a 50% chance the poison will be released in an hour. And so common sense tells us that the cat is either alive or dead. We just don't
Right.
know because we haven't looked in the box. That seems like a reasonable assumption. But what quantum physics is telling us is not that. It's that the
Right.
cat is both alive and dead until an observation or a measurement is made of the cat, which, in fact, Schrodinger came up with this example because he didn't like that idea. He's like, this
Right.
is ridiculous. How could the cat be both alive and dead? But that's pretty much, the accepted meaning of the term superposition. Superposition means something has two values. It's going through slit A or slit B, but if it's a superposition, it's going through both of those at the same time. So it's like a superset of all the possible values that could be there. And to me, this looked like an optimization technique, right? When we
Mm.
created video games, I mean, if you look back at games that when I was a kid, like back in the 80s, we used to play Atari and Pac-Man and Space Invaders and these games, and they
Yeah.
were very limited in what they could show. And then the Apple II computer came out, and people started to have games for the Apple II computer, but they were very basic adventure games. It wasn't until you started to see games like Doom, where you had this first-person perspective, that we were able to build bigger worlds inside the game.
Yeah.
And today, if you look at World of Warcraft, or you look at Fortnite, or any of the newer games since then, that's funny, I use those examples, but they're already like 10 and 20
Yeah.
years old.
But people are still playing Fortnite, man. That game never dies, it
They
seems
are,
like.
yeah, but I think it
Yeah.
came out in 2016, so it's
It's
literally 10 years
crazy.
old.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know what that is, ask your kids. They'll
Right.
probably have heard of it. It was very popular for many years. But those games are all three-dimensional worlds, and your character is navigating. But the reason we can build a world that complex and render it on your machine is because we only need to render that part of the world that you can see. And to me, this reminded me so much of what quantum mechanics and the collapse of the probability wave is telling us. It's like render only that which is observed, right? And so it looked like an optimization technique. And so I thought, that's kind of weird. Why would the universe work like we actually build computer games? I'm using this as
Yeah.
an analogy now. And why would it have bits? Because inside a game, you think you're seeing a character shooting, arrows at a dragon, but you're not. That's just, first of all, that's just bits of information, right? The first proposition, everything is information. The second is that it's getting rendered for you in a way that it looks real, but there's no castle, there's no dragon. It's just bits of information.
Yeah.
But the reason we can render it for you is because we only have to render the part of the world that you are in or which you can observe. And just like, I'm not really talking to you right now, am I? Right?
Right.
I'm
You're
talking
talking to you're talking to a simulation of a simulation, pretty much. At least
exactly.
maybe another layer that I'm not even aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, there could be another layer, but even if we just take it at the physical layer that we're familiar with,
Right.
uh, you're seeing, this background. You don't know for real, like, see this pyramid on another
Yeah.
planet, this picture, which is my girlfriend is an artist. She does
Oh, cool.
these amazing scenes of Egyptian pyramids and things, but you don't know if that's real or not. That could be a virtual background. More than that, though, I'm in Phoenix, and your computer doesn't have to render all of Phoenix. It wouldn't be able to. There's like too many pixels to render.
Right.
You only have to render the part that the virtual camera can actually see. And so that was what really sealed the deal for me. And that's why I wrote this book. And there's a whole chapter on this idea. And there are other aspects of physics that remind us that we might be in a simulation. But for me,
Right.
that was one of the key points.
Yeah.
And then there's two other propositions, which I can just finish those really quickly. Those are
Sure.
because those link back to what we already talked about. But the fourth one is that this is all a big hoax.
Right.
That it's a false reality. And I like to use the story of Roger Ebert, the film critic. Do you remember him?
Mhm. Yeah, for sure.
So,
Yeah.
he was really well known in the US. Maybe your international viewers may not know him as much. But he died not that long ago. And he died, unfortunately, of throat cancer. But his wife was with him when he died, and they had conversations about the nature of reality. And the last thing he said, just before he died, like his last line was, "Oh my God, it's all a hoax."
Wow.
And his wife said, well, that really meant he was realizing and confirming that this physical reality is a kind of hoax. And then finally, the last proposition is that we agree to be part of this hoax. We choose a character, just like in a game you might choose a race, like a elf, a dwarf, a human. You might choose a general profession. You might say a thief, a warrior, a cleric, a bard. And then you might choose a general storyline, like we're going to go raid, the keep at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, or the dragon from, Neverwinter Island or something like that. So
Yeah.
you generally agree on these storylines, but then you go through these campaigns and things come up that are very unpredictable along the way. And so those four propositions together, I think, encapsulate,
Yeah.
a very large part of why I think we're in a simulation and what that actually means for people.
I hope that's true. I hope we chose to be here. And I love sort of collecting different thoughts on this point from different thinkers. Like Bob Monroe, for instance, he definitely thinks we choose to some degree. Have you one idea that's sort of an interesting remix of this that is maybe a little more esoteric, but I'm deeply into Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is one of my favorite sort of strains of thought. But Plotinus has a sort of unique idea, probably the most well-known Neoplatonist thinker, and he thinks so. He was known for doing these sort of like astral ascent meditations. Seemed like very contemplative, and there's actually some scholars who think that his teacher may have been a yogi because
Sorry, this was
his
who again? Sorry, this was
Plotinus,
Plotinus, yeah.
or Plotinus, however
Yeah.
one says it
Yeah.
properly. But he would do these sort of like these astral ascent meditations, and the highest experience for them was what they would call henosis, which is essentially dissolving back into being the one, going all the way back up to the top of where everything is emanating outward from. But he would describe what he called the undescended self. So meaning that this would be like the player in your sort of ontology. So
Right.
basically re-merging with this higher self and realizing that this is sort of a projection of whatever that is. But he described it as soul fall. So he would talk about it essentially as some aspect of that higher self sort of getting either enamored with something else or some vice or aspect of itself to a point where part of that kind of emanated downward and solidified back into a physical form, and then you're stuck in this sort of superposition between here and there where again you forget, right? You forget that you're actually this higher thing, but you can recover that wisdom through, essentially deep contemplation or meditation or altered states or whatever. But there's also, and this is also, speaking of Lethe, in at the end of Plato's Republic, they essentially outline this exact thing. There's this whole myth of Ur, where this guy goes through the classical near death experience from like 2,500 years ago, and he goes before the fates. And the fates give him an option, basically, like or give everybody an option that and it's very poetic. Like it's different figures from ancient history who get these different options, basically, depending on what kind of life they've lived. So it's like some modicum of free will, but not total free will to choose whatever you want, which also kind of builds in a level of karma. So it's got that going for it too. But this also, it seems like there's also a really strong evolutionary argument for all the things that you're saying. And this is one of the reasons I love Don Hoffman. I've talked to him a number of times too.
Oh, great.
And he, he basically comes to the same conclusion as you, and he gets there through evolutionary game theory, arguing that you don't need, like, from the standpoint of this, it makes practical sense, right? Of course, I don't need to render all of Arizona to have a conversation with you in Arizona while I'm in Austin. But there's actually a very practical sort of evolutionary fitness reason for this, right? Because you need to know, from Don Hoffman's perspective, I don't need to know the literal truth of reality to be fit and survive in this world. I just need to know I can reproduce with that. I can eat that. I can't eat that because that'll poison me. That thing over there will kill me. So it doesn't have to be that we're having this, naive realism form of reality. And not only does it not have to be, his argument is it would actually kill us. Like if we actually saw reality as it was, it would be so overwhelming that we would have no evolutionary fitness and we would just die. So that's another very interesting sort of enhancement, I think, of this argument, is that it makes sense that we actually don't want to see reality as it is, and we can't see reality as it is. So we have to live in some kind of simulation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, I met Donald. I interviewed him. I had what I call version 1 of my podcast a few years back, which I haven't done anything with in years, but I may restart it here soon. And we had a good conversation about this. But, he used to use the interface model, and he would say on your desktop, there's a blue file folder with a file that you can double click on and open it in Microsoft Word. But there's no such thing as a file in reality. If you look on the hard disk of the computer, there's no place that looks anything like the file. It's just a bunch of bits. And in fact, if you know anything about how computer science works and how hard drive works, the bits aren't even there in order. Like, they could be spread out throughout the hard disk. It's just logically they're brought together in this thing called a file. And so he used to use that as a metaphor for how reality gets rendered. And of course, now I think he uses the virtual reality headset as a metaphor, which I think leans even closer to the idea of simulation. I did want to mention one other thing as you were talking about the undescended self.
Plotinus.
Yeah, Plotinus. So if we look at our in video games, the character is called an avatar. Right. And so where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from the Sanskrit term. But the backstory is interesting because, George Lucas had set up his company, Lucasfilm, after he did Star Wars and became super wealthy. He set up his own company, and they started building video games and graphics computers. A lot of stuff came out of that. Actually, Pixar came out of Lucasfilm. Steve Jobs took it over. But around that same time, there were these guys who were building the first, I'll call it a multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG. I won't call it a massively multiplayer because this was back in the days of the Commodore 64. And they would literally use a modem and a dial-up line to a bulletin board. It had that, that old sound of the modems. It was like while it's connecting over the phone. And you would be in a room with about 5 or 10 other characters. So that's why I say it wasn't a massively multiplayer game. It was called Habitat. And so you would have your little character that you would control on the screen, and it was a 2D version. And so these guys were trying to figure out what to call this character on the screen. And they turned to Sanskrit because in Sanskrit, an avatar is usually like a human incarnation of a divine entity. So there's this sense of this very large entity that squeezes itself down into a small human body, small from the perspective of, the divine entity. We're small. And they felt like they were doing the same thing. They were taking their physical body and their self, which is large compared to the computer. They were squeezing it into the phone lines, and they were populating this little character, itty-bitty 2D character on the screen. And so that's where the term avatar comes from. And I think it's quite appropriate because there's a spiritual element to it.
Yeah. And I love when there's like these weird, I would love to believe that all of these guys are deep into like Hindu philosophy and like Western esotericism and stuff. But it's almost like it's even more poetic and synchronistic because it does seem to be more coincidental, because that's one example. But another example is Daimon, right? Like Daimon in a computer system is this like little program that runs autonomously. And I was hoping, like I was looking up, you probably know this actually, piece of trivia. I'm forgetting who actually coined the term. I think it was somebody at MIT, but I was looking into, were they aware of like Greek esotericism and like the classical daimon sort of idea? And from my understanding, the answer is no. And they were pulling it from some philosophical thought experiment. There's various philosophical thought experiments like Laplace's demon or whatever. It's something like that.
Demon, yeah.
Maxwell's demon.
Yeah. I mean, the term demon was used by a lot of these guys, Descartes' demon as well. Yeah. Almost for like a process that was running beyond, the human being's knowledge, and that could be an entity. And so I think they ended up borrowing that term for these processes that run all the time. Now, it's fascinating you bring it up because I mentioned earlier that I think that a lot of what we call angels in the scriptures are actually like these daimons or daemons, depending on how you look at it, how you pronounce it. They are processes and functions more than they are actual, personalities or entities. And, I was talking about forgetfulness earlier, and I was on a podcast with Mayim Bialik, who was one of the stars of The Big Bang Theory. For those who've watched the show, Sheldon's girlfriend. She also used to be Blossom back in the 90s, which I never watched, but some people
That's
know
what
her
I'm
from
more
that.
familiar with as
Really?
like a kid who grew up in the early 90s. Yeah.
Well, there you go. So somebody is more familiar with that. And so anyway, I was telling her about, the veil of forgetfulness and the way that there are these metaphors to describe that process of forgetfulness. And she said, we have that in the Jewish traditions as well. I said, oh, that's interesting. Well, what's that? She said, well, there's this angel. And what happens is just before you're born, you learn everything, basically. You get all knowledge. And then this angel, she called it Lilith, but I think it's actually Layla when I looked it up, presses your upper lip. And that's why we all have a cleft
Oh, I've heard of that.
in our
Yeah.
upper lip. But when she presses there, you forget everything and you're born as a baby. So you now have to relearn everything. And so, to me, that was a perfect example of an angel being used to represent a process. I don't think they meant that this angel goes to every single baby born everywhere in the world and presses, the lip. It was meant that we all go through this process of forgetfulness. And so I think, a lot of what the angels are doing um, in the scriptures, are especially like the lesser angels and a lot of even the gods in the pantheons. They represent aspects or functions or processes that are running. My favorite one are the recording angels. Do you know about those?
Vaguely, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the recording angels are angels who write down what you did, and it's coming from the Abrahamic religious line, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And there's something called the Book of Life in the Bible, and the idea is that your name gets written down in the Book of Life if you get into heaven. And St. Peter is there to make sure your name is in the Book of Life. So again, St. Peter is being described as a process, right? It's just checking whether your name is in the book. And the book is being used as a metaphor. I don't think they mean there's an actual angel with a feather pen that's writing down and dipping it in the ink and then writing down in Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic your name. And so, but in certain Jewish traditions, particularly as you get into like the Kabbalah, but even in just the mainstream Judaism, the Book of Life, it actually is like more like a page of all your deeds. So it's more than just whether you get in or not. Whether you get in or not is based on your deeds, and you're supposed to review them every so often. And then in Islam, in the Quran, they actually get into this in a lot more detail. They have 2 recording angels. They even have names, the Kiramin Kitabin, and one of them writes down all your good deeds, and one of them writes down all your bad deeds.
Interesting.
And they write them down in what's called a scroll of deeds. And then what happens is when you die, there's literally a verse in the Quran that says, open your book, read what you have done, find out what happened based upon everything you did to other people. And you yourself are sufficient to be the reckoner. And so, I thought about this and I said, this reminds me of is the life review that near-death experiencers describe. And I learned about the life review from a guy named Daniel Brinkley. I don't know if you've
no, he doesn't ring a bell.
So he wrote a book in the 90s called Saved by the Light, which was like a huge, like #1 New York Times bestseller. He had one of the more complete near-death experiences from, decades ago in the 70s. He was struck by lightning and he was out for like 20 minutes.
Wow.
He had all of these different
Is he still around?
Yeah, he's still around. He's in his 80s now, but he's he's an interesting guy. You might want to interview him sometime.
Yeah, it sounds awesome.
Happy to put you in touch with him. And because he got all kinds of, prophecies and things, missions that he was supposed to do. But for me, the most interesting part of his story was always the life review. He called it the holographic panoramic life review. And he basically said you had to relive every moment of your life, but from the perspective of other people. So you could see and feel what they felt in their interaction with you. And he was a bully as a kid, so he used to literally beat up other kids. He got to feel what it was like to be beat up by himself. And he was in the military and he was an assassin. He literally shot people in Vietnam.
Wow.
And he had to feel what it was like for the bullet to come and for that guy to die. But more than that, he had to see what's often called the ripple effects, which is, okay, when that guy dies, what about his wife and his children? Right? And the flip side too, when he was kind to someone, how did that affect their life later in the day? How did that affect their wife, their kids, and the ripple effects along the way? And to me, as a computer scientist, I remember thinking, okay, how could this be done? If we were in a virtual reality and everything was being recorded, we actually could do this. We could replay. In fact, in the same year that I had put on the VR headset to play ping pong, I was involved with a startup that was building a VR replay. And what they would do is they would replay a game like League of Legends or CSGO. I don't know if you've ever heard of CSGO, Counter-Strike Global Offensive.
I've heard of it. Yeah. I
Which is a
haven't played it, but
first-person shooter.
yeah.
And what they can do is they can take you back to any point in the game. But with a VR headset, it feels like you're actually there on the floor. So in CSGO, which is a first-person shooter, you can shoot someone, and we can put you in that XYZ position of your opponent, and you can see what it was like for the bullet to hit you. Now, of course, we don't do feelings or emotions, and we no ripple effects. But to me, as a computer scientist, I thought, well, how would this all work? Well, if these angels are actually just more like AI processes that are recording everything, and then everything is like a VR virtual reality, and you can kind of put on a headset or a hologram and replay everything. Well, that explains the life review, but that also explains the metaphor of the book, the scroll of deeds, and the reviewing of the scroll of deeds, and the book of life. So all of that we can think of. I mean, most scientists would dismiss that stuff, but if there's a techno-scientific mechanism for how that could work, well, maybe we shouldn't dismiss it, in such an outright way. We, meaning scientists in this case. Religious people take it very seriously, but there's something in between taking it literally, like it's literally a book. St. Peter is literally standing there at a physical gate, versus saying the essence of that, but implemented in a way that we now understood, how that might actually work.
Yeah. And to emphasize all of this even more, in the Western esoteric tradition, particularly when you're reading Neoplatonists like Iamblichus, but not by any means just limited to him, they talk about daimones, so these beings, which are just from we got to go pre-biblical here, so not evil, but just essentially they're entities with a job. That's how they're always talked
That
about.
makes sense.
So they're like a class of beings that are sort of between physical reality and the higher reality, which you could think of again as like outside the simulation. For them, they use nous, like mind. So it's like you have all these beings of mind, which are of a more primary ontological quality. That's where all of the immortal beings and immortal principles live. But then you have these go-between beings that are daimons, that are doing jobs. So it's like, again, so similar to exactly what you're talking about. And again, they had like esoteric ways for like directly interacting with these things through rituals and stuff like that. But it's so crazy how apt and one-to-one these ideas just map to one another, from these ancient esoteric traditions to computer science. It's like, and what's even more crazy is, again, how we just synchronistically, intuitively almost rename them the same thing, even though we know that they weren't like reading, these texts. It's like, oh, you know what that's kind of like, and then they're just they pick the perfect word, daimon. It's so crazy how that ends up working.
It is pretty wild. I mean, even
Yeah.
like the idea of multiple lives in video games, right?
Right.
I mean, they weren't really talking about reincarnation, but they used the terminology of multiple lives to go back and pick up where you left off, or start again. And they were doing it, totally. They were doing it because of quarters, right? You're putting quarters in the machines. But it all kind of works out that way, which is quite interesting. And in fact, in the Islamic traditions, and this might be true in some of the biblical traditions as well, the one thing that differentiates angels from humans is that we have free will, and angels don't. And so once again, it's like an entity with a job to do that is basically a messenger or a process of God that just does what it's been told. And it has to follow the rules. And we have rules too, but we also have free will. So we are able to change things. And so that's one of the differences, which is quite interesting, I think, when you think of the NPC. So one of the things that I talk about in my books with simulation theory that not a lot of academics talk about. So when people like Nick Bostrom talks about the simulation hypothesis, when Elon Musk talks about the simulation hypothesis, they're mostly talking about the NPC version, as I call it.
Right.
NPC stands for non-player character or non-playable character. And the term actually comes from the old Dungeons and Dragons, the desktop games, which have become popular again because of Stranger Things, I think, partly.
Right.
But back then, you would have your characters in the party, and then you would have the dungeon master, the DM, who would basically control all the other characters. And so any character you came across, like a bartender at the, the jolly old British inn or whatever it was,
Yeah.
and the guy at the armory who's going to sell you, the +3 crossbow that can kill dragons, all of these things, the shopkeeper who gives you a clue as to where they last saw the dragon flying, et cetera, all this stuff. Those are all like NPCs. So those are characters that are controlled by the code. And so I like to say there's the NPC versus RPG versions of the simulation hypothesis. And the RPG version stands for role-playing game, where the player exists outside of the game and we have a character inside the game, just like in the Matrix. Right? In the Matrix, Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity all existed outside of the Matrix. And then they had their character, their avatar inside the game. Now, of course, in the Matrix, they look the same. Why? Well, if you're going to pay Keanu Reeves to be in your movie, you want to be able to use him as an actor in both inside the Matrix and outside the Matrix. But in a video game, we don't have to. I mean, our character doesn't have to look like us. It could be a completely different, could be an alien character if we're totally spiritual beings. So we don't have to look like us. But in the RPG version, we are avatars with players. And this is actually more of a continuum. In the NPC version, if you said 100% of people are NPCs, well, then it's purely a simulation of the type that you might have when you simulate the weather. You're just running it on a computer, or you're trying to simulate, oil flows under different circumstances, or the path of a meteor, or the virus spreading, whatever, all these types of things. And then everything is just code. If we're all player characters, then I think it gets closer to what the esoteric traditions and what the spiritual traditions have been talking about. But in a video game, it's a continuum in that it's not 100% one or the other. You have both inside a video game, like World of Warcraft. And I have a new idea or concept of this, which I call NPC mode. And what I think is what happens to a lot of us as we go through life is we go into NPC mode. Now, that term NPC is used kind of disparagingly online.
Right. Yeah.
But as someone who just repeats what they've heard, and NPC mode is kind of the same thing. It's when we've forgotten who we are and our mission. Of course, we all forget to a certain degree, but when we just take what we've been trained on here in the physical world, whether it's, our religious upbringing, our political affiliation, our nationality, our particular profession, and we just repeat the things that we've been told in that, just like an LLM. I mean, LLM will repeat the things that it has learned off of its training data. It's not going to go outside the training data. It might hallucinate a bit, but it's based on the training data. And so I like to say when we go into NPC mode, we're like forgetting our souls and we're just repeating the things that we've been told, along the way. So anyway, that's why I like to say angels are kinds of NPCs. We turn into NPCs sometimes too, but I don't, I always tell people, don't assume anybody is an NPC. Assume that they are also a player character. Like I had a woman tell me once, I think my husband is an NPC. That's probably not the best basis.
What are you doing in that relationship?
Yeah, it was probably not the best basis for the relationship either. But she meant it in the terms of, okay, he's now, these challenges that I have, it's almost like the system is rendering this person for me to have this challenge. But if you think of them as NPC mode, just like in a movie or a film, we have different side characters who are also actors, but they from our perspective, they just have, there's a small role to play. And so we may be doing that for other people all the time. So that's another element of NPC mode that we might go at. But I much prefer the player avatar model person.
Yes, for sure. Two substantive things I really want to riff on with you before we finish up. One path that I want to go down for sure that, I could hear Don Hoffman yelling at me in the back of my mind because we sort of abandoned him at one point in the conversation, is the centrality of consciousness to this conversation, because that's one of the big problems I have with the, traditional simulation theory as proposed by someone like Bostrom, which is essentially part of it, at least, is that simulations are just going to keep getting more and more complex until they're indiscernible from reality. And then eventually simulated agents or characters will become so complex that they themselves will somehow just gain consciousness in some kind of epiphenomenal way where they'll become so advanced and will get so good at simulating a brain that poop out comes the gene out pops the genie of consciousness from the lamp of the simulated brain, when meanwhile we don't even know if that's how consciousness works to begin with. This sort of standard epiphenomenal argument of like, the complex brain is what causes consciousness. And I was very happy to, I mean, obviously I think people have probably already gathered through this conversation that doesn't seem to be your view on the matter.
Right. So, the reason I bring up the NPC versus RPG versions of the
Yeah.
simulation hypothesis is to provide a recent, kind of more technological way to think about the same idea, which is this ongoing debate on whether consciousness is fundamental or whether it's just a property that is emergent from the neurons of the brain. And a parallel kind of conversation is the one we were just discussing with the angels, is do we have free will? Right?
Right.
Many scientists believe we don't have free will, that the decisions are made by our neurons and it's pretty much a deterministic process. Now, whether that's true or not, I think it's important to say that many physicists and scientists try to say free will is randomness in the system. And I don't necessarily believe that's the case, but there's a process. There's a computational model known as cellular automata. I don't know if you know what
Mm.
those are. They're basically just like little lines or 2D grids where you have different cells that pop on and off based on
Okay.
different rule sets. Probably the most famous one is called the game of life,
Mm.
where there's a rule that says if the square next to you is lit up and the one behind you is lit up, then you have to light up. And and if all the cells follow that, then the next time the square next to you
Yeah.
will not light up or whatever. So there's all these rules, and they create these
Hmm.
complex patterns. So there's a whole field called complexity science, and most people have heard of this through chaos theory
Okay.
and this
Yeah.
idea of the butterfly effect. And the butterfly effect is basically one where it's an example of the complexity of things, where the butterfly flaps its wing, let's say wings in Hong Kong, and the stock market in London crashes, for example.
Hmm.
You don't know what the exact relationship is, but there's a whole series of things that happens along the way. And the point there in complexity theory and chaos theory is that small changes can result in big differences in the outcome down the road. So even in these deterministic processes, right?
Yeah.
So a demon, as we talked about it earlier, is an entity with a job, is basically a deterministic process. Laplace's demon was, if you get theoretically, Laplace said if you gave it the initial conditions and the rules, it could calculate everything in the whole world. So basically,
Yeah.
it thinks that everything is a deterministic process
Hmm.
that goes along the way. But even in a deterministic process, so even if we didn't have free will, which is not my position at all, as you can see, but if we didn't, it still means that the future is unpredictable, which
Right.
is weird because it's just following the standard rules. And so there's something called computational irreducibility. So
Hmm.
this is a term that was introduced by Stephen Wolfram, and he's one of the scientists who really got to study cellular automata, and he believes the whole universe is a series of processes. But what he said about computational irreducibility, it was that you needed to run a process all the way through to find out what will happen for
Mm.
complex processes. Now, there are certain processes where they just stabilize. They go like this, change values, and then they stabilize. So that would be like a cellular automata that lights up here, there, and then it just lights up in one place and it stays the same. Or like two cells flip on and off, and that's all that happens into infinity. You can predict that because those are stable processes. But chaotic and complex processes, you don't know what's going to happen at step 2,000,000 unless you run the program and you
Wow.
get to step 1,999,999. And then you don't know what's going to happen at that point until you get to 1,999,998 and so on and so forth. And so the only way to find out what's going to happen is to run the process. That's why we run simulations. So
Interesting. Okay.
even if we don't have free will, even if we're just based on a simple set of rules, you still don't know what's going to happen unless you run it. And that is one way of thinking about the universe. Now, I tend to think that free will has to come from outside of the system. So even if it is a biological system that has to follow rules, and there are algorithms of nature, I like to say computer science is eating all the other sciences, right? Or information science is eating the other sciences because we're learning that even DNA is really just a way to pack a lot
Yeah.
of information within a certain amount of physical space, and then that information is used in order to do processing and create proteins, etc. It was kind of
And
John von Neumann. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
haven't they also shown that you can literally store data on DNA? Like you could use DNA as a substrate for like binary information.
I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, if you think of the genes, and they have like, it's not quite binary in that they have like four different
Koans.
values.
Yeah.
And
Not
it's like
koans. Not koans.
the
That's something
koans are
else.
Zen, right?
Yeah.
I forget exactly
Yeah.
what they're called, but within genes, you've got these four different values, and you can the DNA strand you can think of as a very long strand that basically encodes these values. But yeah, I think you can have DNA as an information storage system. I'll have to look that up, but I do remember reading something about that. Uh, and so they still have to follow all of these
Yeah.
rules. But I think to have true free will, it almost has to come from outside of the system. And that's why I tend to believe consciousness comes from outside of the system. And that's why I think like the video game model is actually a really good one, because inside the video game, even in a game like Grand Theft Auto, which is,
Yeah, totally.
we call it an open world game. It seems like you can go in and do anything. And there's a new Lord of the Rings game coming out where you can just run around Middle Earth and do whatever you want. But even then, it's actually an illusion. There's still limits to what you can do. The game developers will enforce the rules, and they have quests that you have to take on. But you, the player, can still make the choices on whether I'm going to go in this direction or I'm going to go in that direction. And the system, which is run really by code or by AI these days, right? The system will adapt itself based upon your choices. And to truly have that choice, you have to be outside of the game. That's why you have to be an outside player who is then moving the mouse or putting on the virtual reality headset or putting on the full body suit and making those choices. And so that's why, I almost think that we can think of the player as the source of consciousness and the character as the reception of consciousness in that way. And so I tend to lean more towards that than the other way around. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky is I mentioned NPCs earlier, and in video games, we've had dumb NPCs in the past.
Right.
They were really stupid. I mean, you could only say a few things to them, and you would get this little, kind of selection on the screen that says, okay, tell him, you want to ask him about, the fate of Atlantis or whatever. I was playing an old Lucasfilm game called Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis over the holidays, which was from like 1989 or 1991 or something like that. It was one of the old adventure games. Right? So the NPCs were very limited, but they would respond, and you could go back and you could choose something else and they'll respond differently. But if you go back and you choose the first thing, they're going to respond the same way. But today we have smart NPCs.
Yeah.
Okay, and smart NPCs are being built with LLMs using like a ChatGPT or Claude Anthropic or some other back end. And those actually, they're much more intelligent. You can actually have conversations with them. And in fact, there was a game that came out. So there was a fourth Matrix film called Matrix Resurrections, I believe, right? In 2021, end of 2021. So it was literally about 5 years ago. And they released Epic Games, which is the makers of the Unreal Engine, which is one of the most realistic engines for building video games. And the fidelity is getting very good with those.
Yeah.
They released a demo they called The Matrix Awakens. And you had, Keanu Reeves, Neo, and Trinity. They were driving around the city. And the city looks almost realistic. Even back in 21, you couldn't really distinguish that.
I remember this.
City.
I remember it.
Yeah.
Yep.
But more recently, AI has come along that can make that might look even more realistic. But one guy went in there and he hooked up the NPCs in that within that city. So that city, there were like only certain places you could go, and there would be a barrier, but the NPCs could go through. So he hooked up the NPCs to a LLM engine, so they became smart NPCs. And he started walking around and telling them, "You're in a video game. You're an NPC."
Yeah.
And they started responding like humans might. And they said, "No, I'm not an NPC," or some would be like, "Tell me more." And others would be like, "Hey, I have to go to work. I don't have time for this crap." And it was interesting you get those reactions. So as we passed the Turing test, and most people think we've passed the Turing test for text, which is this test where you're passing messages to an AI or to a human, but you don't know which is which.
Yeah, indistinguishable, yeah.
And that was actually a paper by Alan Turing in like 1950, which he called The Imitation Game, because even though there was a movie about Alan Turing called The Imitation Game, it wasn't about the Turing test. That was about his work during World War II. But that was the original point of it. Most people think we've passed that with chatting applications. But there's something that I introduced in the second edition of the simulation hypothesis called the metaverse Turing test, or the virtual Turing test, where you have to walk around inside virtual reality with the avatar that's controlled by a human and an NPC, but you're not told which is which. You can talk to them, you can do things, you can go, skydiving, you can go swimming, you can dance, you can do all these things. And then if you can't tell the difference, we'll pass there. And so I think where it becomes a little bit tricky is when you get to that point where you can't distinguish between AI and humans. Now, I'm of the belief still that consciousness comes into an entity biological entity that has enough complexity to host that consciousness. But we're also kind of like the Sims, where like with the Sims, you're controlling it, but you may not be doing every little thing. You're kind of watching it do things for you. So our player is kind of sitting there watching us do things for us. And when we go into NPC mode, that's kind of how we are. We're just like getting commands and we're getting prompts and we're doing things based on those. But I still feel that consciousness exists outside of the system. That's my personal belief.
Yeah, and again, this like we were saying before, it's one of those analogies that again it maps so one to one to so many of the world's mystical or spiritual traditions that there's this idea of some kind of higher self that we are an avatar of. And I think, yeah, man, I think we're rediscovering it at every level. And I've arrived at the same exact sort of metaphors you like to use myself, like that. I think that is the sort of MMORPG analogy is a really good way to sort of split the difference on a question like free will, right? Where you have a limited scope of free will within a limited reality. So again, pick your favorite MMO open world, just like you did. And to a degree, like you can choose how to navigate that. And I think very similar again to the mythoverse sort of scenario, there probably is somewhat of a point or somewhat of like a soft fate that you come into the world with, where you might have this sort of archetypal unfolding that can be expressed. And this is what Jung thought about individuation as well. He described it as like nature trying to almost like do something cathartic through through like your psyche, basically. And psyche as in the Greek sense of soul, not just like the way that we popularly think about psyche in pop terms now, or modern psychological terms, but in the idea that no, your psyche is really an extension or function of, Jung called it nature or the collective unconscious or something, that can do something unique, totally unique, that you can either accomplish or not accomplish. So yeah, I'm right on the same wavelength. I'm right on the same wavelength, man.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, I kind of agree with the idea of some level of fate, and I feel like that's because it's part of the life selection process itself, right? I mean, remember how I described in a video game, you get the character, you choose the race, you choose the profession, but you also choose the storyline. And I believe that's what we come in with, is a kind of a storyline. And that is part of the challenges that we are going to face in this life, as well as the accomplishments or achievements. And so in a game, you have quests and achievements. And each character, is eligible for certain quests and certain achievements along the way. And there's a part of you, the player, that's choosing those, saying, okay, let's go do that one. Let's go do that one. I kind of view it like a writer's room in a TV show.
Yeah.
Like they might know the arc of the season, But until they write each individual episode, they don't know what's going to happen to you in each episode. They know broadly where it's going. Daenerys is going to bring her dragons into Westeros, right?
Yeah.
In that case, they had the book, so I guess they knew in a little more detail. But in general, the writers' room will choose those challenges. What are we going to throw at them next? What are we going to throw at them next? But we also have the ability to choose in an MMORPG scenario. But I believe there's an element of manifestation that we can do, but sometimes manifesting certain things is easier for us than manifesting other things. And why is that? It's what I call appropriateness for our storyline. You can call it your karma, but I call it part of the selection. Now, when I was in middle school or in high school, you could have asked me, what are you going to do in your life? And I would have said, well, I'm going to be a software entrepreneur and I'm going to be a writer.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't know exactly when. I thought when I'm old, I'm going to switch from being a software entrepreneur to a writer. And I thought old was like 28 back at the time because I was still in high school at the time. And that is kind of what happened. But it took a lot of different twists and turns to get me there. And I held off becoming a full-time writer for a long time. I was still in Silicon Valley. And I feel like sometimes we get a course correction.
Yes.
And that's kind of what happened to me, is that I actually had a borderline heart attack and ended up in the hospital and got heart surgery. And I've talked about this somewhat, but I haven't talked about it fully. But while I was recovering in the ICU, I didn't have a kind of traditional near-death experience, but while I was recovering in the ICU, I had a series of visions. Again, I'd call them almost like shamanic journeys, where I'd be aware of myself in the ICU, but I'd also be, having these conversations with these other beings in another place. And to me, they looked like Tibetan monks. Later, I would realize, they're not really Tibetan monks. That's just how they were presented to me, because having studied various Tibetan dream yoga traditions, that was a format that was acceptable to me.
Yeah.
And that would give me the right, kind of mindset, or I would react to that in a certain way, kind of like a mini simulation. But
Jung,
yeah, I was going to say, while I was recovering and I'd have these conversations with them, they were also doing healing work on my non-physical body. It was like in a little alpine lake with what looked like an old temple building, and we'd sit outside and watch the monks windsurf. I called them the monks on the borderlands because I felt like it was like a halfway house between life and death. Like I didn't have an near-death experience because I was never technically dead, but this was like somewhere in the middle. But they told me, hey, don't you remember that you had this plan? And when you get out of this, what you're supposed to do is write. That was your second part of your storyline. And what happened was I had a very long and complicated recovery process. And I would end up back in the hospital. It was definitely one of the biggest challenges I've ever had in my life. But during those 9 months, the message was coming through very clear to write. And so I didn't have much energy to do anything else, but I had enough energy to take an Uber to Starbucks and to write for a couple hours a day. And that's how I ended up writing the simulation hypothesis. And at the end of that 9 months was, March 31st, 2019, the 20th anniversary of The Matrix, which is when I wanted to get the book out. But I actually finished 2 books in that time and published, one and got a contract for the other. And before that, it had been kind of a hobby. Writing had been a hobby of mine. But that was when I started to take it more seriously. And every time I tried to jump back into Silicon Valley, like I'd say, oh yeah, I'm going to go back and do another game company. We're going to do this Walking Dead game or this Game of Thrones game. I would end up back in the hospital. And it was almost like part of me was doing this course correction because my conscious mind here, I was in NPC mode, conditioned by Silicon Valley that this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to you're supposed to do a bigger company. You're supposed to build $1 billion venture capital fund. That was kind of what I was consciously thinking I would do next, but that wasn't necessarily the wishes of the soul, as one of my mentors, a guy named Robert Moss, who does shamanic dream work, would call it, the wishes of the soul. And that kind of came through with my writing after that. So I do believe we have storylines and we have certain fated things, but we can always make choices, good or bad, along the way. Yeah.
Yes. Have you heard of the book Soul's Code by James Hillman?
No, I haven't heard of that one.
So this is really fascinating. He's a sort of post-Jungian psychologist. He comes up with his own sort of strain of philosophy called own strain of psychology called archetypal psychology. But he uses Plato's myth of to basically riff on exactly what you're talking about, which is so as you might remember this from the Mythover, is you select your fate, you go through these sort of spheres as you're incarnating, and one of these planes is Lethe, and that's when your mind gets wiped. But after you select your fate, you also get an attending spirit. The Greek word is daimon. So
Right.
it's your daimon whose
Yeah.
job it is to basically keep you binded to your fate, which you forgot. So
Right. Right.
one of the things he talks about in Soul's Code is that the daimon can become more like a demon when you're living out of accord with whatever you're supposed to be like doing or whatever your selected fate is. So crazy things can happen to you that seem like hugely unfortunate, right? Like a health event or
Right.
your business fails or relationship fails or whatever, but maybe that's what needed to happen for you to follow the path you need to follow. And this sort of gets into I feel like I have to ask you this because inevitably, I think about like the skeptical listener who may or may not exist thinking, well, yeah, this all sounds great. You have a storyline, whatever. What about all the unfortunate, tragic, diseased, senseless things that happen in the world? Did those people choose that? And it's always like, I don't think the reality of those things or the problem of evil negates this by any means. But how do you typically answer those
Well,
questions?
yeah, I mean, there are people who bring that up all the time, right? And they also bring up a related assertion is, hey, I'm not in a simulation or I'm not in a video game. You know why?
Mhm.
Because if I was, I would make myself a billionaire and I
Right, right,
would
right,
make
right.
myself really important or an actor or an actress. I would live, on a big mansion and I have a yacht, right? And so the question is, how often would you play that role, right? You might get bored with it pretty fast, and that's basically I like to view that as a life of little difficulty, and life is a series of quests, and what's important about these quests is that there's quests of higher difficulty and lower difficulty, and we only open ourselves up to the quests that we can actually handle at this point in time. And so, this is an age old question. It's a question of theodicy, which is
Mhm,
there
mhm.
can't be a God. And it's funny, I've had this happen to me, particularly on liberal atheist podcasters,
Yeah, right.
right?
Makes
And they got
sense. Yeah.
upset that I would suggest that simulation hypothesis might be a way to show there is a God, there is a creator, and that we might have a soul. Boy, did they get upset when I said that. It was interesting.
That's crazy.
Because, you know, they rejected all religion because religion has become so institutionalized. And
Mhm, mhm.
but because of that, they want to reject anything, including the mysticism that resulted in the religion in the first place, which to me is the more important part. But the religions
Totally.
don't, tell us that they don't tell us that there's no suffering in the world. In fact, they tell us the opposite. So Swami Yogananda used to say, ceaseless joy is not the nature of this world, right?
Mhm,
In
mhm.
fact, the world consists of a type of suffering, right? Even the Buddha would, that was one of his Four Noble Truths, because we identify with the role that we're playing. And when do actors win Oscars? It's usually when they play particularly difficult roles. So I would suggest that perhaps that experience of going through these bad experiences, whether it's war, famine, uh, physical handicaps, perhaps those who are born with a physical handicap are actually more advanced players who chose a higher difficulty character and a different storyline because they wanted to give the other people like remember the life review like the nature of this game and how it's measured at the end, I don't think is Grand Theft Auto, where how do you mistreat
Right.
other people, right? It's you can measure it like just like a football game, at the end, you can look at the score, but the coach will project the game to say, hey, what did we do well? What did we do wrong? Right? It's an opportunity to improve. And I believe that the
Mhm.
life review shows us that how we treat other people is actually the point. So perhaps the people who are suffering are giving us the opportunity to one experience, for them to experience the suffering that perhaps they've caused in another life, perhaps they just want to understand. But more than that, maybe they've given us the opportunity to decide whether we are going to cause that suffering. And I think as a world, we're failing right now with what's happening. We're making decisions at a civilizational level where we are causing suffering to other people in other parts of the world. And we're like, that's fine as long as it's not us. But I feel like that's an important part and component of the game. And there's an old rule in the video game industry. It was put forth by Nolan Bushnell, who was kind of the grandfather of video games. He was the founder of Atari. And he said, make it easy to play, but difficult to master. Right. Because if it's not easy to play, nobody's going to play it. If it's easy to play and easy to master, you're going to play it for a little while and you'll get bored. But if it's easy to play but difficult to master, you're going to keep playing it and you're going to keep going through all of those challenges. So what makes the story interesting is that we're not given all the answers at once. I often like to use the Indiana Jones archetype to say that if we are on our own hunt for the treasure, and actually wrote a book called Treasure Hunt about this a while back, which was about synchronicity. But Indiana Jones doesn't get all the clues at the beginning. He doesn't just get a little map that says, here you go. All you have to do is go, there's, the Ark of the Covenant. Go get it. What happens? He gets one clue.
People play Elden Ring willingly. People play Dark Souls willingly, myself included, like games that are extremely difficult that make you feel like you're running around in a world of knives naked. Like, that's a thing that people choose to play.
Yeah.
And there's a reason, because it's like incredibly satisfying when you get through it.
Yes, exactly. And I would suggest that perhaps that's part of the issue here. Now, that's a very interesting thing you said about that book, The Soul's Code. There's also a book called Journey of Souls. I don't know if you
Yes.
By Michael Newton. And for those who don't know, he was a hypnotherapist and he hypnotized patients to take them back before birth. But he didn't go all the way to a past life. It was in what the Tibetans call the Bardo, or the in-between, or some people might even say it's heaven. And one of the things he found was that there were these similar stages people remembered from that time in between lives. And one of those stages was planning your next life and choosing. And they often described it. This is interesting because they often described it like a computer screen with like these lines and these major decision points. Like you could go that way, you can go that way. But then just before that, just after they've chosen the life with like this broad outline, they also had to cram with their friends who they were going to meet, kind of like practicing with like actors practicing lines before they go and do the actual stage play. Or I used to be in drama back in high school. We used to have all of our practices, and then we would finally go and do the play. But except in this case, we're going to forget our lines because of the forgetfulness. And so they would plant these little impressions or clues or signs. If you see someone, a little girl on a red bicycle, or someone has a certain earring, or someone laughs a certain way, it's going to jog a memory. And that's how you're going to find me. And like in a video game, MMORPG, you might say in a raid, we're all going to go meet at this castle and do this raid on Tuesday night. It's a similar kind of thing that's going on there. So anyway, that was kind of a complicated way to answer, but I think that's the way that I think about it. And it's a way to give the suffering some meaning. And some people don't like that because they're like, no, the world is just suffering and that's it, But Swami Yogananda used to say, it's after you meditate, after you sleep, you are ready to go back for the beatings of the world. Because that's basically
it's one of those things on one hand you can't make sense of, but I find myself often in this place where you have to try, because we don't live in a totally chaotic, random, meaningless world. We live in a reality that is like aesthetically beautiful, shouldn't exist in terms of just raw statistical probabilities. Clearly there's fine tuning. Clearly there's all of these aspects to reality that are highly sensical, and we live in an intelligible reality we can do a lot of things in. But yet there's also all of these other unfortunate things. So like I think the mind has to grapple with these two things, and I think taking either extreme is not super logical. But one of the things, man, I really wanted to talk to you about, I can't believe we waited until this deep in the conversation to talk about, is I know you and I are both going to be at Contact in the Desert this year, both be giving talks. And I think you have one of the best takes personally on the UFO phenomenon and how it could fit in to reality, and why the sort of simulation hypothesis could be one of the best ways in terms of explaining what UFOs are, what NHI is. because it kind of nests right into this conversation we've been having, right? That whatever these intelligences are, this anomalous phenomena, high strangeness, it could be essentially information or agents or consciousness from outside the simulation coming into the simulation. And wouldn't it look incredibly anomalous and alien and strange if that were the case?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've been, part of the UFO community for a number of years. Uh, and I was involved in a film called Thrive: What on Earth Will It Take?, which
Mm.
was really big during the Occupy Wall Street days after the
I think
financial
I
crisis.
remember that
Yeah,
vaguely.
Foster
Yeah.
Gamble, who's one of the direct descendants of one of the founders of Procter and Gamble, and Kimberly
Okay.
Gamble, his wife,
Mm.
they had made this film, and I was an executive producer. That's actually how I met Danny Sheehan and a
Mm.
lot of people in the UFO community, well before the New York Times 2017 article. But
Yeah.
it was when I sat down with Jacques Vallée in Silicon Valley that I started to think about this more seriously. Jacques' background is also as a computer
Yeah.
scientist.
He's
Um,
on
a-
my bucket list of guests for sure.
yeah, he's getting up there in age, so
Yeah.
need to get him on soon, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he's got so much wisdom and so many interesting stories. But uh, there were two aspects of things he told me. One is regarding the beings, but one is regarding the craft. Let's start with the craft. Is that he said there have been sightings where it seemed like one person could see the UFO and the person standing next to them couldn't see the UFO. And at that point, he'd been started to work with Gary Nolan, and later Gary Nolan told me that there were cases like this where people were sitting next to each other, and one saw a donut, and one saw like a whole different shape. So they were like in the same
Mm.
car, looking out in the same, and they saw something completely different. And so that began me thinking about um, what if these were projected into our reality? And it seemed like there are many cases where they fade in and then they fade out of our reality. Almost like if you've ever been in a video game where there's like multiple worlds. I mean, one way is you get in a spaceship and you try to travel, but the other way is you portal, right? You portal from point A to point B. And what happens is you get de-rendered in one place and you get rendered at a
Mhm.
different set of XYZ coordinates. And there was this one case in particular that Jacques told me about that really got me thinking. And he said took place in like Northern California, Southern Oregon, the Pacific Northwest, where there's these big giant redwood trees. And he said there was a clearing in the trees, and the witnesses reported that the UFO came down and it basically landed in the clearing and then took off. And all the other investigators were focused on the clearing, looking for physical evidence. But Jacques stayed behind, and he said, "There's one thing I don't understand. You said it came down at a 45-degree angle. But that means it would have had to have cut through the trees, but there's no trees here that are cut." And they said, "Yeah, it like passed through the trees." But we didn't want to say that to anybody because we would sound crazy, right? So
Yeah.
even within the UFO world, there are elements of, craziness or things that fit that don't fit. There's like a access of believability that gets applied. And, I just published a white paper or an academic paper
Mm.
where because as part of my academic work, I actually interviewed like 20 plus professors who had studied UFOs openly. And it's called UFOs in the Academy: A Study in Stigma, uh, Boundary Work, and the Edges of Legitimate Science, and included Gary Nolan, Avi Loeb, a lot of these guys, including people who studied UFOs back in the 70s and 80s, like Peter Sturrock from Stanford. So it was
Wow.
professors. And one of the things that came out in that was that the nuts and bolts side of the ufology has gotten more respect within modern academia, even though it's still a heavily stigmatized subject, but the abduction phenomena hasn't.
Mm.
Anyway, people can find that online if they just search on my name. But so in this case with Jacques Vallée, it was almost like it was being projected like a hologram initially, but then by the time it landed, it was a physical object and it left some physical traces. And to
Yeah.
me, that reminded me very much of how in a video game, when you're rendering, you can kind of move through walls like the rules aren't quite as set. There's also something called ghost mode that sometimes you can switch into where you can move through walls and do things. And so again, it made me think that in a virtual world, UFOs could be projected here into our reality. But this gets back to the second part, which is in a culturally appropriate way. And this gets back to, Jacques' theories that maybe UFOs aren't um, aren't extraterrestrial after all, but that they've been here all along. And you have stories of beings like the Fae and the Celtic
Yeah.
traditions. And his book, Passport to Magonia, describes a whole bunch of people in different European traditions, or people meaning other types of beings. And in the Middle East, we have the jinn, and in Pakistan, India, who are beings that are already here with us. But the idea is that these are being presented to us in a way that we would understand and we would interpret as aliens, just like the airships in the 1890s, like they
Right.
were
Right.
interpreted as airships. And then in the 50s, if you talk to any contactees in the 50s, they always say, "Oh, we're from Venus," right? Or "We're from Mars." And is it possible that these beings were lying to them, but doing it in a way so they could understand? Like if you said you're from Zeta Reticuli, nobody would take you, that seriously. 100, 200 years ago, people would think you're nuts. So as scientific understanding advances, it's possible that these beings are presenting themselves in a culturally appropriate way and perhaps even deceiving us on that front, right? By
Yeah.
calling themselves aliens. Because you know what? That is actually, even though a lot of academics don't like the UFO subject with aliens, at least it fits the paradigm.
Right. At
Like
least
we
it
can
fits within materialism.
yeah,
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
understand, okay, somebody took a ship. It may have taken them a long time. Maybe they created some advanced drive, but they came from another solar system because now we know there are enough planets. So it's almost like keeping up with our scientific knowledge. But our science does not know about these non-physical dimensions yet, right? So it doesn't talk about, the jinn. And, some of the ancient abduction stories. So talking on this, it's possible that they are avatars of these beings that are presented to us
Right.
a certain
Exactly.
way. Like there was a story that Whitley Strieber told me that really got my gears thinking. And he said there was a young man in, let's say, LA, who said he met this young woman and they had a relationship and she got pregnant. And she called him to her apartment one day and he thought they were going to get married because, she was pregnant. And she said, "Well, I have to tell you something. I'm not really human." I was like, "Really?" She said, "I'm like a gray alien."
Whoa.
He was like, "What?" And then she changed in front of his eyes into like a
Wow.
gray alien. But then she changed back to her human form. And she said, "And I have to tell you something else. I'm going to take the baby." I mean, she was pregnant. There was no baby yet, but "I'm going to take the baby into the gray alien with the gray aliens, and you're never going to see me again." Now, okay, to some
Wild.
people, this is just a bad breakup, right? She had to come up with an
Yeah.
excuse. But
Yeah.
the fact that he saw it, he saw her change, like that so much reminded me of avatars in a virtual. So I
Uh-huh.
was doing some research, and in the medieval Middle Eastern traditions, there are stories of jinn that are very similar. There was like a guy who would marry a jinn woman and they would have kids. And then one day the jinn woman would say, "I'm going to take these kids back to the world of the jinn," which humans are not allowed to go to, but because they're
Right.
hybrids, they can go back and forth. And I was reading that and I was like, wow, that sounds so much like, modern abduction stories,
Yes.
especially with the
Yes.
reproduction and the hybridization element. Are there beings that could live in both worlds as well? Anyway, so all of that led me to believe that perhaps these other beings are presenting themselves to us a certain way to make us comfortable. It's kind of a science fiction sounding thing, but it would make sense in a virtual environment, along with many other psychic phenomena that materialism wouldn't allow. But if we were in a virtual reality, not only would it be allowed, it would just be one of those skills that you can get along the way.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I'm such a huge fan of Valet, of Keel's ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which is sort of similar, that whatever these beings are, the physicality of them is downstream of their true nature, and they use their physical forms as a way to interact on this level temporarily, but that's not what they are. Whatever the body, the form is sort of this just means to an end, or this like trickstery sort of downstream effect of some higher intention that he would say exists in some sort of like extended electromagnetic spectrum place or something that we don't have the ability to sense yet, which again sounds exactly like these ancient wisdom traditions who talk about higher worlds, subtle realities, or non-physical realities that are primarily comprised of like, I don't know, like mental sorts of beings or whatever. And I think it has to be something like that. And not only what you were saying before, does science, not know about these other dimensions yet? It would be predicated on something that most scientists would reject, right? Because it would be predicated on the idea that, hey, you get to these realms through mind. And to them, mind is just like some epiphenomenal, materialistic, temporary illusion construct, whatever. So yeah, not only do we not know about it yet, they would just reject it out of hand that could even be real because it's, to them, consciousness is just this epiphenomenon. But yeah, I think there's no other explanation that makes sense because you have to account for the panoply, the massive diversity of these weird experiences. And you either have to say they're either all delusional completely, or you have to say that, you know what, maybe the physical aspect of it, the way that people experience it is not as important as the archetype, the meaning, the and also what they're drawing people toward, right? Because that's one of Vallet's big fascinations is that there's almost this like carrot and stick kind of thing going on with the phenomenon where they seem to be showing us technologies that are just out of our reach. And then by seeing these technologies like the airship example or something, it somehow like inspires human ingenuity to keep pushing forward. So yeah, there's all these aspects to it, but that is one thing that I'm pretty high conviction on is that if there is a there when it comes to all the high weirdness stuff and UFO stuff, which I think there is for sure, it's got to be something like that. Like the physical ET hypothesis for me does
Mm.
not seem like the most parsimonious one.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't rule out that there could be some ET element to it,
Right.
uh, but it would explain why, astronomers aren't seeing these big ships coming into motherships coming in, to Earth, yet they're here in some capacity, and we don't know exactly how they got here. But yeah, I think I'm a big fan of the work of Diana Pasulka and Jeffrey
Yeah.
Kripal as well, and I think even
Yes.
John Mack ended up it's interesting. John Mack was co-chaired a conference at MIT in 1992 about alien
Mm.
abduction. And I know it was in June 1992. I remember this date specifically because that's when I graduated as an undergraduate. And I remember
Oh,
seeing
cool.
something about it. And I was like, what? An alien abduction conference here at MIT? That was just bizarre. I mean, it was by invite only, so I didn't go as an undergrad, but it was interesting that conference even happened. And then since then, that subject, the alien abduction phenomena, has been pretty taboo. And Jeff Kripal
Yeah.
has picked it up with terms of experiencers and now the archives of the impossible. But I think it hints at this idea that reality may be different than what we think it is. And so by defining it a certain way, we're ruling out all of these things. I think we have the wrong cosmological model. I often like to use the
100%.
example of, you know, meteors, and scientists dismissed accounts of rocks falling from the sky. They said, it's just, peasants who are crazy saying this stuff in like France and Europe. Why? Because there are no rocks in the sky. So how could they be reporting rocks falling from the sky? We know that to be true. Well, it wasn't until there was a mass sighting in the fields of France in like, I don't know, 1803 or some year like that. Don't quote me on the year, but that one guy went out to actually, one scientist went out to investigate it, and he said, "Look, there's something really, interesting going on here." Enough people report it that something actually happened, and the problem was the cosmological model was wrong. It wasn't that these things didn't exist. It's that there we needed a model that allowed for rocks in the sky, and we had to change it. And same thing here. We don't have a model that allows for beings that we can't see to be here with us. And maybe if we update that model, and simulation theory is one such model, I think that could allow for that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and it seems honestly like the low-hanging fruit model that people may be slowly warming up to, even on the academic side. But there's again, there's such an important distinction because there's your simulation theory and then there's the Bostrom simulation theory. And I
Right.
one of them I totally dismiss because I just like can't get down with some of the core assumptions of it. And then there's your version of it, which builds in all of this other stuff that I'm like, yes, this is the direction we need to go in. So thank you. This absolutely flew by, man. Thank you for the work you're doing. You're a brilliant guy. I really enjoyed riffing with you. Um, yeah, tell people about whatever you have going on before we
Yeah.
get
So,
stopped.
you mentioned Contact in the Desert. I'll be there. Also in May, I'm going to be in Nashville on May 16th with William Henry, who is a regular on Ancient Aliens. It's
Oh,
interesting
cool.
when William and I originally met, he was very against, transhumanism and AI and simulation theory. And now we're doing a whole event with myself, William Henry. He's come around to simulation theory as a possible way to explain some of the Christian miracles, for example. And Dr. Travis Taylor, who people know from Skinwalker Ranch. So we're doing an event in Nashville, and I'm doing an event in San Francisco, in Berkeley, on May 1st. And people can check out my website. It's zenentrepreneur.com, which is based on the title of my very first book, Zen Entrepreneurship. And they can reach me on social media, Riz Stanford on X or Twitter, and Riz Cambridge on Instagram.
Fabulous, man. And I'll see you at Contact.
Yeah, I'll see you there.